I am certain that 9/11 was a conspiracy.
The byproduct of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter.
So you must have some ideas.
Well, we have some suspicions. Obviously, a group of operatives that have access to three of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon obviously have help from above. We don't know how high this conspiracy goes, how wide, but a real investigation will let the chips fall where they may.
Who do you think?
I don't know.
It's for a good cause. Oh, you tried to trick me there.
And you got any thoughts on Richard Gage as a speaker?
Richard Gage is a very good speaker. I saw his 9/11 Experts Speak Out, Explosive Evidence, back here at the OEZ building a few years ago. That was very good. He's very articulate. He's able to bring the events away from a YouTube conspiracy theory genre to a university lecture standard, which clearly the movement needs to bring it more on a university level. The film Academia in 9/11, I think I said that wrong, but that is making headlines in the academic world because now they have to kind of address this. Well, for the past almost 8 years, you discussed this, you were bashed, labeled a conspiracy theorist, and almost discredited while just asking questions. And that's a huge, huge problem in my own opinion.
Toronto 9/11 Truth, we're here, we're at U of T, we got Wing Knight here, we got Richard Gage is here, and even Michael Corn's here. Word up, Toronto Truth Seekers.
Nice.
What do you think about the 9/11 truth?
I don't know. I'm here to find out.
Michael Berry, Shane Bob, how are you?
Hello, how are you?
Nice to know that.
Who else is involved in the conspiracy? Well, I mean, the truth is a liberal faithful for goodness sake. Yeah.
It's not a matter of...
I'm Karen Brothers on behalf of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're here for a really exciting evening for those who want to know, as all of us do, more about what happened on September 1st, September 11th, 2001. We have three amazing personalities here tonight, along with Richard Gage. And I'm going to introduce, all of them have been significant in the 9/11 movement. I'm going to introduce one of them, and they will then introduce each other. Barry's vicar, who many of you will know, it was the first television, was the first person to go on television, on nationwide TV, and uncover what that 9/11 was a false flag operation. As you may remember, if you lived in Toronto, he had a Vision TV program, and he followed that up with the book Towers of Deception that's also quite stunning. He's been married for 50 years, and he wants to say he has not driven or owned a car since 1967. So he's quite an amazing person. So there's Vic.
Thanks. What Karen didn't say, I've been married to the same woman for 50 years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Richard B. Lee, who will then introduce Richard Gage. It's an evening of Richards. And I'll just mention three things about Richard B. Lee, whom I much respect. He was elevated, if you will, or elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is a considerable honor, well earned. Then he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences of the USA 2 years ago. So there's two feathers in his cap. And he was, as far as we know, the first professor in the world to teach at the university level a full credit course taking a critical look at 9/11. So that was really a first. And to top it off, this would be the third feather, I guess, he's one of about 30 full professors out of 1,800 at the University of Toronto to be a professor emeritus in anthropology, it so happens. So he's more than well qualified to do an introduction.
for that introduction. So we're here for a memorable evening, and very proud to be the Toronto stop on the 17-city Canadian tour that Richard Gage is making. So this is an exciting evening for us. Richard Gage has been an architect for 26 years in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects, AIA. He's a professional who is willing to place his credibility and reputation on the line and who has endured substantial personal sacrifice. A tireless and tenacious advocate for questions that all too few are willing to ask and truths that fewer still are willing to contemplate, truths that may shake the foundations of our worldview. His deep concern about the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center high-rise towers on 9/11 and about the state of our country, or of their country, began after hearing the startling conclusions by a Claremont, California theologian named David Ray Griffin on 9/11, whose pioneering book called A New Pearl Harbor was one of the key launching pads of the 9/11 truth movement. Dr. Griffin was interviewed on an eye-opening day in May of 2006 on KPFA's Guns and Butter radio program by Bonnie Faulkner in Berkeley, California. This changed our speaker's life radically and launched his own unyielding quest for truth about 9/11, inspiring him to found the organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. It now numbers over 2,000 architects and engineers, and 10,000 others, of which I'm proud to say I'm one, and all demanding a new investigation into these catastrophic structural calamities and failures. Mr. Gage has been interviewed on radio and TV on over 300 stations and has presented the World Trade Center evidence in more than 80 American cities and more than 30 foreign countries to packed audiences, whose worldview has been irrevocably altered by this myth-shattering information. I'm certain that the viewing of tonight's film will uphold this tradition, and I personally admire the man and the sacrifices he has made to bring this story to wider and wider audiences. Please give a warm Toronto welcome to Richard Gage.
It is exciting to be back in Toronto again. We have given an address to Torontonians. Is that how you guys say it? I like that. It's got a ring to it. You know, it's my deep honor to address the great nation of Canada in this is the 7th stop of our 17-city tour. We started in Prince George, Victoria, Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Calgary, Saskatoon, and now Toronto, Montreal. There they are right here. Fredericton, St. John, Moncton, Halifax, St. John's, Newfoundland we're heading to. So if you have friends in these areas and you're disturbed by what you hear, and I hope that you will be, please see fit to disturb your friends too, because sometimes the truth is disturbing, and it's always critically important. In fact, you know, I want to thank you for your willingness to consider this very difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center towers and the staggering loss of life on 9/11. Just as architecture projects are sometimes quite joyful, sometimes extremely difficult, this particular one has been the most difficult for me. Not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, though. That's actually the easy part, as you'll see. but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions, and finding people open-minded and willing enough, like yourselves, to come and look squarely at the evidence. So my commitment to you tonight is to speak the truth and to leave you with extremely valuable information that will help you think critically, rethink 9/11, winnow error from truth, myth from reality, fiction from fact. So with that in mind, I want to encourage you to do your own research tonight. We're not looking for believers here. Check out the facts that you hear. After all, it's extremely important that we understand the entire truth about 9/11. Why? It served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries in which already up to 2 million people have been killed, 6,000 U.S. soldiers, 158 Canadians, 24 Canadians in the Twin Towers alone. You know, if there's any question about the roots of 9/11, and I hope you'll come away from tonight's presentation with a lot of questions, such as the global war on terror. 9/11 was the pretext for this. In the U.S., $4.5 trillion have been spent on the global war on terror, and guess what? It all goes back to 9/11, or 95% of it. Worse than that is the suffering of our freedom in the United States and in Canada with the Anti-Terrorism Act. In the U.S., any of us can be arrested, charged but not told what we are charged with, held indefinitely, don't have the right to a lawyer or a trial, and even tortured, even assassinated. These things are legal now with the executive orders and the legislation which has been passed without even being read by our elected representatives. It's an amazing thing to have gotten away with all of this without the American people demanding to look at what it was that happened. And of course, there's a whole host of other ills that we're suffering from in the U.S. and around Canada, around the world and in Canada, including Canada, of course. All of this remains intact if we refuse to face the truth about 9/11. And only the truth about 9/11 will keep another 9/11 type attack from happening again, right? So these are the reasons we need to dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why, and peer back into this painful part of our world history, which we've not even seen in the mainstream media. Time magazine, in fact, reports that up to 36% of Americans believe that the events of 9/11, the destruction of the Twin Towers, may even have had some level of complicity within the administration. This is pretty extraordinary. They say it's not a fringe phenomenon. It's a mainstream political reality, this 9/11 truth movement. Well, interestingly, another poll in 2007 finds that 16% of Americans believe that the towers were brought down by explosives, not jet plane impacts and jet fuel and fires. So we're going to be presenting some evidence tonight. Before we do, I want to find out where we are in the room together. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. First of all, how many of us pretty much believe the official story? And I'll explain that. How many of us are unsure? And how many of us may have come already with some idea that, or are convinced by the evidence that these were controlled demolitions, which has a whole other set of implications, right? So first, the official story. Jet planes hit the towers, large explosion of jet fuel, weakening of the structural steel by fire, and then a gravitational collapse all the way down to the ground. There are thousands of scientists, architects, engineers that have looked at this evidence after NIST, the National Institute of Architects and National Institute of Standards and Technology, claims that they found no evidence for explosives. A year or two later, they write that they didn't look for it. This is extraordinary. How can you find what you're not looking for, or won't? But many, many others did, of course. In fact, architects and engineers have been speaking about this evidence since 2008. And as mentioned, we have 2,100 architects and engineers signed on to our petition. How many architects are there tonight in the crowd? Usually a small number, don't see any. Is there one? How many engineers? Watch this. Oh my God. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Wow. How many normal people? Great. You're in good hands. I'm normal. As normal as I'm willing to be anyway. I've worked on, as an architect, these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area, $125 million high school, which I had the construction administration responsibility for after that, and more recently in Las Vegas, a $400 million project with a 9-story mid-rise office space and 1,200 tons of fireproof steel frame in these buildings. So, and that included 6 blocks of retail. I just wanted you to get a sense of who I am. But for the last 4 years, I've been full-time educating architects, engineers, media, public about this issue. And we're marching again from left to right across Canada with the message of the evidence. We're going to be talking about evidence today. We don't have conspiracy theories to share with you. We just look at the evidence because we found that to be the most effective. Now we're going to be going through that evidence quite rapidly today. So you can look at the videos on the left side, you can read about the evidence in the middle, and you can act on the results of that evidence on the right of our website. So I encourage you, if we're going too fast, you'll find a lot more information here that you can digest on your own time. But first, tonight, let's get on the same page, find out what happened that day and how this myth was created.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes have flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So what was the task again?
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just screamed right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
There's people in here who are chuckling. Some of you don't know why. It's kind of an inside joke. I'll just let you in. Here's the gentleman who right away, the first one interviewed on the street, has the story that engineers and architects have been arguing and struggling over for a year to finally come up with the official story. And it's pretty much what the guy on the street just gave you in a perfect nutshell snapshot. And so the guy wearing the Fox News hat. So some people find it suspicious. I'm going to bypass that and we'll go on.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire that caused collapse.
So we have an official story that developed right from the street that morning, actually. And what we're going to do is test that story against the facts, the evidence, and so forth. And we have in the West the scientific method. It's really cool because we ask a question. Well, how did the towers come down? Okay, that's our question. We do some background research, how towers come down before. make observations, construct a hypothesis. I think these towers came down by fire. No, they came down by explosions. Whatever the list of hypotheses are, they're lined up and we don't prejudice ourselves. We look at each one dispassionately. And we're going to see how NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, accomplished this goal, this dispassionate goal. We test with experiments that are best, our hypothesis, and based on the results, we analyze it, draw conclusions, and our hypothesis is either corroborated or not. If it is, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so others can build on the body of our work. And so our work is unimpeachable. It's open. We'll find that NIST, in relationship to this particular step in the scientific method, will not release, for instance, the results or the input data into their computer, which they use to prove their hypothesis. It's basically classified. You can't get it. We've tried. What they said in return to our Freedom of Information Act request was, no, it might jeopardize public safety if we were to give you, the architects and engineers who are responsible for the public safety in these tall buildings, the input data where we prove our thesis. So we have some serious problems, which is one of the reasons we're pursuing legal action against NIST. But say, like we're going to find tonight, the hypothesis is not corroborated. What do? You go back and construct a hypothesis that stands a better chance against the evidence. And that can be proven, basically, to the best of our ability, given the evidence. So we're going to apply the scientific method and gather data and find out, well, okay, how have buildings been destroyed before? This is not too difficult. Fires destroy buildings. Fire moves through an office building every 20 minutes or so, burning up one area, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building comes down, and by the way, a steel frame high-rise building has never collapsed in the whole history of the 100-year history of these. And there are about 100 examples of very hot, very large, and very long-lasting fires in these buildings. But say in a wood frame building, we would expect the building to fall over maybe after some portion of its structure is compromised by this organic type asymmetrical fire. The building might fall over, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance. So let's keep these things in mind as we look at the evidence. And for instance, let's find out about steel frame buildings.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, 9/11 he's referring to, when we had not one, not two, but 3 steel frame high-rises collapse top to bottom with the structure completely shattering, as we'll see. So this is very important information that lends great credibility to our effort to find out what really happened to the towers using the scientific method. And this information was excluded from the official report, as was the history of high-rise fires, where this one in LA burned 3.5 hours over 5 floors In Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Did any of these buildings collapse? No. It's very relevant. These buildings collapsed due to earthquakes. So we have a natural collapse, so we can look and see what happens at the base. Here is the structure that's certainly broken up, but you see what was a building. The structure, one member from another, is not completely shattered. The concrete is not pulverized. We see what was basically a building at the bottom. So very, very important. Another characteristic feature of buildings that are destroyed by explosives, for instance, we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds with a thick edge because these solids are pulverized and suspended in the cloud, and the unfolding cauliflower shape is produced by these massive heat. This massive heat from the chemical reactions. So we also have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. So if we have these characteristics, we know we're dealing with explosions. So you can begin to get a feel for where we're heading here. We're comparing what happens in fires versus explosions. And you'll see that there's a very good reason why we're doing that. But finally, with respect to explosions, they can be harnessed quite efficiently in controlled demolitions. And they are laced throughout the columns and beams, therefore, and set off, synchronized floor by floor, timed so that the building comes down symmetrically, if that's what's desired, or asymmetrically. But it comes down almost at free fall acceleration. Very, very fast, because the knees, if you will, have been knocked out from underneath the building. The members are broken up, ready for loading and shipment, and there's minimal damage to adjacent structures. So there's this key set of characteristic features, including the ones we just mentioned, and also sounds and flashes heard and seen by witnesses, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, squibs, or explosive charges that go off at the upper floors, or any floor. Maybe they're mistimed. Well, there's evidence of these explosives at the base of the structure afterward. So we're pretty sure that these are direct evidence of explosive destruction if you have even one of these, let alone all 10 of them. Interestingly enough, none of them can really be accounted for by fire. And so it's going to be a little bit easier for us, therefore, to determine what brought down the towers. Was it fire or was it explosions? Government documentation can be quite helpful. Experts agree, yeah, it was a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts that aren't biased, those experts that don't have $100,000 contracts with the federal government, that might bias their opinion were they to make it publicly about the Twin Towers destruction, for instance. Foreknowledge, these are planned months in advance. It's a very, very difficult process. Only a handful of companies in the U.S. can even do this kind of destruction that you saw there. And fire has never accomplished that, as you'll see. So, and with video documentation, this is proof of controlled demolition. Well, interesting. With respect to that set of characteristics, let's apply it to the third worst structural failure in modern history, World Trade Center 7, which I didn't even know about until 8 years ago when I was listening to the radio. And most architects and engineers know nothing about this. It should have been the most studied building failure in history. Remember, no plane, no jet fuel hit this building, as you'll see. How many of you have not, like me 8 years ago, aren't very familiar with the destruction of this building, World Trade Center 7? Just not very familiar. Raise your hand, I'll just count you real quick. Go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And let's just take a look at this. Extremely important building. 47 stories, dwarfed by the massive height of the Twin Towers, at the time the world's tallest towers. Now again, it wasn't hit by an airplane, so we're going to find out what happened to it.
And interestingly, it survived the Twin Towers when they went down. A few beams came and hit it. There were some fires that were started. It collapses at 5:20 in the afternoon. And we're going to take a look at that collapse. But just let's start with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the tower? Well, let's listen to Dan Rather as he narrates for us his first look at the destruction of this building.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, here's Dan using his intuition to describe what he's seeing. That's great. We should all be doing that. We've seen things like this on TV before, the old hotels in Las Vegas. Problem is, Dan never mentioned this again in his reporting. In fact, mainstream media had never played this image or any image of Building 7 coming down except for maybe 3 times. And so we're making a great effort to awaken the Canadian public with our Toronto subway train ad. How many of you have seen in the subway these ads? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so it's disturbing, isn't it? Just you're trying to get to work, and all of a sudden you're looking at the screen and your train, and you're seeing this building coming down, which is kind of mesmerizing, right? Well, it's designed to attract attention for a purpose, because we want people to rethink what they know about 9/11 and learn what they don't know and come to tonight's presentation. How many of you are here as a result of that ad coming down? It just caught your curiosity enough, anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. Welcome here. So it worked. Were you disturbed? A little bit? Okay. So let's see if there's a straight down symmetrical collapse and if it's into its own footprint. Well, here's from West Street, the building pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Watch the penthouse. It drops a half a second earlier, indicating core column damage underneath that penthouse. Virtually uniform core column damage. We'll get to that in a moment, but I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's put a controlled demolition on the right, Building 7 on the left, and take a comparison. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? And yet, NIST never has seriously examined the hypothesis of explosives. Even though it looks exactly like one, and even though fire, their first hypothesis, and only main hypothesis, has never brought down one of these buildings. I'm talking about these fires. The worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. They're fairly small, fairly scattered. So 2:30, 3 o'clock, there are fires. On the 12th floor is where NIST says the initiation of collapse occurred around this column, because they say that fire was raging in that area. And what they say is that that fire caused these long beams to expand, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column, causing this floor 13 to fall on 12, 12, and 11, etc. for 9 floors. And then this column buckled laterally, and then the whole thing came down inside the shell of this building. Basically, the whole building being gutted, which is really amazing. There's a lot of problems with this theory. First of all, these beams couldn't expand because they're fireproof. And what they might have done was sag, like in the test that you saw. They're also tied structurally with shear studs to the concrete floor up above, so they couldn't have moved independently from it. But NIST took those shear studs out, saying that they weren't there. Actually, they say that they popped, which is extremely unlikely and unsupported by the tests. They do take out the shear studs above the girder and say that they weren't there, but the structural drawings show them to be there. So that girder could not have pushed sideways with those pins up into the concrete. It could not have fallen off of its seat because these beams could not even have expanded far enough before sagging, so they couldn't have ever pushed this off of its seat. In addition, there were stiffeners on that girder, which would have kept that flange from folding at the bottom of that wide flange girder. So these are called stiffeners. They were in the shop drawings. NIST removed them from their analysis. It completely invalidates their analysis all by itself, as if their analysis was not invalidated by the photographic evidence, which shows that these fires were out over an hour prior to that whole sequence of events, which resulted at 5:20 in the collapse of that building. So so this never could have happened because thermal expansion would have to have been happening during that fire. So I want to show you the computer model that NIST uses to bring down, to prove their building, to prove their collapse hypothesis. What you see here is 400 structural steel connections failing every second. And so that's like shooting a hose on a sandcastle. There's no way, and you know what, that these members could just give up with zero structural integrity from their beam to column connections virtually all at once. First problem. Second problem, we have massive deformation in the perimeter structural steel frame, which we would expect if there was any interior gutting of this building, because it would pull in the frame and break massive quantities of windows, which we don't see in reality in the video. So their computer analysis looks nothing like the video and actually disproves their theory, which is why they stop the entire thing at 2 seconds and will not show us what happens in their computer model after 2 seconds, because the whole thing begins to tip over. They can't even manipulate the data well enough to get it to look like a controlled, like the building came down. So how do you bring a building straight down? You have to take all 80 columns at once out from the building and have that happen on at least 8 floors. I'll show you why in a minute. The fires can't possibly have that level of precision, right? Never going to happen. It's an organic process, and it's never brought a high-rise building down at all. How fast does the building come down?
We can measure the downward acceleration of Building 7 by video frame analysis. I used a magnifying glass to place markers in the corner of the building on each frame. From this we can get a data table and various graphs. The slope of this graph indicates acceleration, which is shown here to be about minus 10.279 plus or minus 0.6. Free fall in a vacuum is minus 9.8 in these units. That falls within the margin of error of this measurement. In other words, the rate of fall of Building 7 in the first few seconds is indistinguishable from free fall in a vacuum.
Well, what are we talking about here? It's as if the 8 stories down here, because that's the period of time during which it fell at free fall, a third of its fall. 8 stories is completely given up. And here's what's happening. Compare that building to this brick. I'm going to drop it. 3, 2, 1. That's how fast the building dropped. That's extraordinary. Why does the brick drop that fast? It has no resistance under it. That building had 40,000 tons of structural steel that was 3 to 5 times stronger than it ever needed to be to support that building for its life. And all of a sudden, without warning, it drops. Well, what about the dismemberment of the steel structure? Here's a 4 to 6 story pile. It's like a house of cards. That was a 47-story building with moment frame, steel frame moment resisting connections, with welded connections from the beam, from the columns to the beams. So every one of them almost had to have been severed in order to bring it down like a house of cards. Remember, buildings that fall due to natural forces, you don't have the complete shattering of the structure. Do we have witnesses that heard sounds of explosions?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. And it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Former Air Force medic and first responder Kevin McPadden. Here is Barry Jennings, who, along with Michael Hess, the attorney for Mayor Giuliani, walked up into the building after it had been completely evacuated. They're walking back up to their office on the 23rd floor, and they experienced this.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. You know, so the sound? Like a boom. Like an explosion.
And more than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run. What?
Fascinating. Bombs like this, perhaps.
Yeah, here's one of the guys that can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
So NIST investigates dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds of witnesses. None of this testimony of explosions ends up appearing in the official reports. Why not? None of it. You think this testimony is extremely important for the record. Do we have evidence of chemical charges down at the base of the towers? Well, we'll come back to this section when we get to the Twin Towers. For now, we have 8 key characteristics of explosive destruction, none of which can be attributed to fire, like these fires, for instance, in Building 5, which completely engulfing Building 5. If any of the towers were to collapse due to fire, we would expect it to be this one, which actually had real fires in it. Did it? No. High-rise, mid-rise buildings don't collapse due to fire. Nor did this 44-story building in China in 2009, which had fireworks land on the roof, and this fire just blazed through the building, top to bottom, fully engulfed. Did it come down? Here's before, here's after, slightly toasted around the edges. No, it didn't come down either. But these small fires brought this building down in 6.5 seconds and into a pile, into its own footprint just about. Fascinating. Well, what about the original FEMA report, which was taken over by NIST after their 2002 report? They say the specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Our best hypothesis, fire and then random damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. What do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? You go back and you look for another one that stands up against the evidence. This, of course, was not done, but it was recommended. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. But unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve the issue, 99.9% of the steel was packed up and sent to China for recycling within a couple of weeks after 9/11. 400 truckloads a day they were removing out of these sites. It's a complete illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, the crime of the century. Prompting Bill Manning, editor of Fire Engineering magazine, to cite crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. Well, what do the experts say? Here's one. Top European controlled demolition expert, Danny Jawenko. Somebody brings a laptop to him, shows Building 7 coming down. He said, have you ever seen this one? And he says, no. And he said, well, what is it? And here's what he says. Starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. Team of experts did this. Professional work, without a doubt. Then they say, well, did you know that happened on 9/11? And he goes, what? They must have worked very fast. We'll talk about how long it takes to plant explosives in buildings. We have 60 to 80 structural engineers who also demand a real investigation with signing statements very similar to this one. Is that Steve? Hi, Steve. I just saw you. I'd like to have everybody extend a huge debt of gratitude to our website master and designer and web team leader, Steve Olson. Awesome. Thank you, Steve. He's been working with us for 5 years now, and I have never met him. The last time I came to Toronto, we couldn't meet, so we're going to have a beer together, and we're going to invite all the rest of you to join us. Not just Steve and I, but each other. We've all got a lot of things to share. Is there foreknowledge of destruction? Well, fascinating. Here's some mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion, looking back over their shoulder, looking at it, and then looking into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down. Building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Flame, debris coming down.
Whoa, the building's about to blow up? Since when do fires blow up buildings on command? Well, it gets better than that. Here's Kevin McPadden, having been moved back 6 blocks and with everybody else away from Building 7 because they're told it has structural damage. It's gonna come down. And he's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? Here's Jane Stanley of the BBC announcing the building collapsed 20 minutes before it happened. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day, after having given the reason that it came down as well, structural weakening due to the Trade Center collapse. Wow, this is amazing. Does that make them psychic? Something is going on here. The CNN does much better, Go USA, announcing it at 11:07 that morning.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan's taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now,
this is really interesting. There was no other 50-story building that went down. In fact, there was no other building other than the Twin Towers, which were 110 stories, that went down. So 15 minutes after the towers, they're announcing the collapse of this building. Was it supposed to come down at that time? Had it come down at that time, it would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud, which is pulverized concrete. We'll get into that. That happened just 15 minutes earlier. So many 9/11 researchers suggest or speculate that it was supposed to go down at that time and it was a dud, which is why these construction workers were going back in to fix it, which is why they're coming out of it announcing that it's about to blow up. So that's pretty interesting, but it's not evidence. With regard to the evidence before that you saw, is the hypothesis of controlled demolition provided to your satisfaction, do we have at least 8 of the 10 characteristic features of controlled demolition? Is that explosive destruction evidence to you? Can fire create those, all 8 of those, or any of them? And with additional corroborating evidence, which we have looked at very quickly, is this proof to you of controlled demolition? So relative to Building 7 now, how many of you believe that the towers, that Building 7 came down according to normal office fires, according to the official story? Please be honest with you. I'm being dead honest with you. I hope and expect and pray that you'll be honest with me. Nobody? Nobody? Maybe you're unsure. You're still looking at it. You're not quite decided. Real high. I can't. There's one. Thank you. Anybody else? Just one, 2. Okay. How many of you think this building came down by controlled demolition? Yikes. Okay, so we're the ones with the big problem here. Okay. Let's put on our other hat. Our we got a problem hat. Okay. Who's in the building? I mean, right. Who's thinking who could have been responsible for this? I don't know. But let's take a look at the tenants, because they give us a sense of the security that this building must have had. Department of Defense, IRS, Secret Service, CIA, the Office of Emergency Management, which runs the whole city in the event of a major catastrophic emergency. The Securities and Exchange Commission, a highly secure agency that's responsible for, well, for investigating crime on Wall Street. They lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases that they were actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. And these were they were on the 12th floor where the worst fires were. So we certainly want an investigation of those fires, right? And see what was really going on here. But our main point is it reasonable to conclude that Al-Qaeda could have got into this building to set these explosives? Most people suggest no. And we don't speculate. We just leave it up to you. Again, what we're after is an investigation which lets the chips fall where they may. A real investigation, which we're having a hard time in the U.S. getting. Which is why in September we raised $500,000 to put massive billboards all across around the world in 12 major cities, including Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa. Ottawa creating quite a fuss with the ads in the buses where we were accused of upsetting the families. And the families started the 9/11 Truth Movement, by the way. And we serve the families' interest in pursuing justice on behalf of their loved ones. Only the truth will heal the families of the victims of 9/11. So we're inviting you now to learn more about that truth, not just with Building 7, but the Twin Towers, which we're going to get to. And you can do that by signing up on our email list. And also this will be used by the local activists here in Toronto to let you know what the latest screenings are. There's a whole number of very interesting topics spanning across the events of 9/11 that the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth have a fairly narrow focus just on these 3 high-rises. It's enough to keep us busy. So if you'd like to be on our mailing list, find out the latest evidence, latest efforts toward a real investigation, please put your name, your phone number, your email, and you'll be on our mailing list. So if you guys can pass that to the back. Also, we need your help. So we're going to pass around a box. And in this box, if you could open up your wallet and dump the entire contents. No, I know that you already paid $20 or something to come, and I really appreciate that. I'm not asking you to stretch beyond unless you see that we have an extremely important role to provide in exposing the truth of this evidence to the Canadian people, because this tour is extremely important, and trust me, we have taken a bath on it in the first part. There's not enough people who are like you, willing to come forward and look at it. So yes, we want to shore up our ability to, Mike, bring that down to the front, would you please? And help us. Our hands are tied for lack of funds. I get a salary. This is a non-profit organization, but we have 20, 40 volunteers, depending on how you count them. So we'll let you handle this. Now, this is not a church, so if you could just don't feel guilty if it comes to you and you just want to pass it on, that's really cool. But thank you for supporting us. We have extraordinary work to do. Part of this work involves this gentleman. Anybody know this guy? He is the NDP MP in Ottawa, where his constituents have gathered 1,400 signatures. And that's calling for the Parliament to have a real investigation of what happened on 9/11, based on the evidence you're seeing here tonight. He's sitting on it, and any MP is likely to sit on it without pressure. So we're relying on you to provide that pressure. And we figured out how you can do that in 10 seconds. So if you go to the website, tinyurl/petitionndp, on your smartphones even right now, or rethink911.ca, and look for the petition or letter campaign there to Paul Dewar, we will ask him to take the petition, which he has in his office, and walk 10 feet down the hallway and submit it to the clerk. That's all we're asking of him. And it's not too much. It's his responsibility to his constituency who have signed that petition. I'll give you one more chance to write that URL down, rethink911.ca.
Have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
So you got to see the rest of that. It is a great film. Here's the DVD for $10. Experts Speak Out. And Ed Asner, a friend of ours, narrated a beautiful story about Building 7. And it's just 15 minutes long. It's only $5. And it sets the background for the evidence for the Twin Towers, because Building 7, not hit by a plane, no jet fuel, theoretically nobody died in the building. People can absorb that information, particularly because it's new. Their minds aren't filled with the kind of emotional and mental baggage that we all have relative to the towers. So when we have people's attention, when you have people's attention with Building 7, that's the time to talk about the towers. And how do we do that? We'll see if it works for you. Because when we put the lens on of the way we're going to look at building the towers, looking at evidence also that most people haven't seen, it begins to become even more clear than the evidence for Building 7, which was pretty clear to most all of you. Well, some people loved the Twin Towers with sculptural purity, and some people, like Robert Stern, hated it. Gigantic dumbness, right? You extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. I mean, compare the kind of building design you had with unfolding Art Deco in the forms and masses in the Empire State Building. So, however you feel about its aesthetics, you should be aware that it was an engineering innovation that was lauded at the time, and by NIST, because of its robust structural strength, extremely redundantly designed. Why? Because they were nervous. They're trying something new. They grouped, for the first time in skyscraper history, the core columns around the elevator shafts, leaving a 20-meter area or distance across to the perimeter columns of open office planning. I mean, it's incredible. No columns between me and the back wall there. The core behind me and the perimeter wall out there. Lay out your offices, really open, airy, pretty nice. Except for the perimeter structure was so over-designed that it could carry 20 times the loading, according to its engineers, that it was designed, because it was the exterior structure in the Verandale truss with vertical and horizontal elements that was able to resist 140-mile-an-hour winds that you can get in New York. So that over-design for lateral resistance made it extremely strong, but as you can see, there's more steel here than glass, which made it undesirable, which is why maybe at the time of 9/11, it was about half full. Interestingly enough, these buildings were purchased by the owner, Larry Silverstein, in a deal which just ended 6 weeks prior to 9/11. He had previously owned Building 7, bought the rest of the buildings of the World Trade Center complex, even though it had a great need for mechanical and electrical upgrades. It had asbestos, which the city was requiring to be abated, which was $1 billion project at least, and it was half occupied. Okay, that's not evidence. We'll set that aside. What is the weight of these columns, almost solid steel at the base, 52 inches by 22 inches, and mid-height 2 inches thick, all around, very, very massive columns. Up at the top, very lightweight, maybe only a 3/8 inch thick, 8-9 millimeters or so. So the lightest part up at the top, and almost solid steel, even in these perimeter columns at the bottom. This is a 100,000-ton heat sink. Any fire, NIST claiming 900 degrees Celsius in these fires, which there's no evidence for, but such fires or heat would have been conducted away from the source throughout this massive heat sink system. That's the reason that we don't have collapses in high-rise, even when there's no fireproofing, as in the tests that you saw. That test in the UK, those steel beams did not fail, even though they were not fireproofed. But let's look at the planes. Flight 11 hits at 8:46 in the morning, and it is over an hour and a half later that the building fails. I'm mentioning this because a lot of people equate the failure of the building with the planes and the jet fuel. NIST says the building did its job in resisting the planes. Yeah, there were some broken columns. But it was the fires, they say, that brought these buildings down. It wasn't jet fuel. All the jet fuel did, well, first of all, most of it burned up outside the building and immediately, 90% of it. The rest of it burned up in just 10 minutes, leaving normal office fires for the substantial life of these fires before collapse. And same thing in the South Tower. So we're not talking about jet plane impacts. We're not talking about jet fuel. It's not an issue. We're talking about normal office fires. And these highly exaggerated normal office fires are causing, according to the official story, the floor to sag. And the floor is supported by lightweight steel trusses, which NIST says the fireproofing was knocked off of by the impact of the airplane. Okay, we'll give them that. But a sagging floor provides very little or no additional horizontal load on those columns. So what does NIST have to do to get their computer model to fail? They impose an artificial 5,000-pound load on every one of those columns so that they will fail in their computer model. Now, there's one word for this, and I call it fraud. And this is just one example. But guess what? This is not the subject of our discussion tonight either. Fraud is, but what fires can or can't do to structural steel is off the table. What we're talking about is evidence for controlled demolition. I want you to get that really clearly, because people will argue about jet fuel, argue about planes. What we want to do is focus the argument on the evidence for structural destruction by explosives. So we look for the sudden onset of destruction like we did in Building 7, not at the base of the building, but at the point of jet plane impacts. Why? We're looking at a magic show. It's an illusion. It's a deceptive controlled demolition. They want us to focus on planes and jet fuel because that's what the spectacular photos show us. What's going on underneath is something very different. Series of explosions we're looking for which we were looking for witnesses that hear the sounds of explosions. They see the flashes of light. Light is produced in the oral histories of the first responders that New York City was hiding until August of 2005, until the court ordered them to release it. Now, of the 500 FDNY oral histories, 118 of these firefighters and first responders we find that are witness to sounds of explosions and seeing flashes of light. Shook my bones, one said. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. One floor under another. We figured it was a bomb because it looked like a deliberate kind of thing, synchronized. What are they talking about? Here's the North Tower on the right. Here's a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity, just looking at it? Sudden onset of destruction, bands of explosions like the first responders are talking about. We'll take a closer look. But is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? We think so. Seemed like on television, when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around, like a belt, all these explosions. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then a flash kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Here's the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? So we can ask or demand for a new investigation based simply on the videos. And it gets even better with the videos. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive.
We started one. Floor by floor instead of popping out. It was if they had detonated. If they were planning to take down a building. All the way down.
Fascinating. How do they engineer these?
Then we crack it up at the top to get it started. We go every other floor all the way down. Every explosive has a timer on it. That's why it's controlled. When the columns go, each floor goes down and impacts the one below and keeps going.
Mark Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition.
You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
So they don't have to start at the base. Well, let's look at Newton's third law. This claims that the upper part of the building, above the point of jet plane impacts, drove the rest of the building down to the ground. Let's just see if that's even possible. We'll look at Newton's third law, which says, if in the case of a Volkswagen and a Mack truck, there's going to be an equal and opposite destructive force. So, as much mass as runs into the Mack truck, say the Volkswagen, might dent the bumper or destroy the bumper and the grille, maybe, right? It's not going to destroy all the way through. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. Equal and opposite destructive force. The upper, lighter part of a structure that's weaker cannot possibly destroy the intact, cold, hard steel that's much heavier and stronger beneath it. This alone pulls the rug out from under the official story. In fact, let's just take a look and see what's happening here. The upper part is being destroyed in the first 4 seconds. I'll make that even easier for you to take a look at here. There is nothing left after 4 seconds of the upper section to drive it down to the ground. In fact, we're seeing belts of explosions that are actually helping to destroy this upper part, just like the fireman described. Start. And stop. You see those bands of explosions completely symmetrical all the way around the building and developing. Now what we're told is this upper part drove the rest of the building down. There isn't any photograph, no video that shows an upper block destroying anything. What you're seeing is something else. What are we seeing? It looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, with upward, outward arching streamers, laterally free-flying structural steel units trailed by thick pyroclastic-like clouds, indicating the ends of these structural elements are burning. Okay, what are we looking at? Is it a gravitational collapse or an explosion? Look underneath. We have a violent series of explosive activity well beneath the so-called pancaking collapse up above. Look down here to the side. Rapidly expanding or advancing wave of demolition explosives going off well ahead of everything else, maybe mistimed, we don't know, traveling as fast almost as the free-falling debris on the side. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse? Well, it's pretty straight down. It's out, but it's pretty straight down. In fact, it's equally distributed about each of the towers. We would expect in a natural collapse parts of the building to fall over, like certainly the top part. Compare that massive, equal, dismembered structural steel elements, one from another, to the nice, neat pile of Building 7, which are equally dismembered, but in a nice, neat implosion, compared to the very explosive event known as the World Trade Center destruction. And that includes squibs, or isolated explosive ejections like you see here. NIST says these are puffs of air. Well, these are pulverized building materials. They're occurring at 160 to 200 feet per second, propelled by explosives at these speeds. And they're 20, 40, even 60 stories down below this zone of destruction. Now, let's say there's a giant piston up there pushing this air down in the core of the building back there. And that air's got to come somewhere, right? So NIST is saying it comes into the building, the open office area, right? Whoosh, pressurizing the volume of this space. And then if it's going to blow out any windows, it's going to blow out all of them, right? Not these finely pinpoint accurate violent ejections that appear to be engineered in patterns. It's just not natural. How fast is the building coming down, by the way? Let's time it. We have 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, about a dozen seconds. Each of these buildings completely destroyed, shattered in a dozen seconds. That's, once again, at almost free fall speed. Faster and faster and faster, straight down through what? Through 90,000, 100,000 tons of steel, equally divided between the exterior and the interior. Almost free fall speed, straight down through that. It makes no sense, alone, due to the physics. Every one of these points completely pulls the rug out from the official story. Are the members completely separated from one another? Indeed, in fact, well beyond the perimeter of each of the towers. And let's look at the South Tower's dismemberment. It actually begins to fall over, but then disappears into this massive pyroclastic-like cloud of dust. Now, it's falling at 22 degrees. We would expect it to continue its angular momentum and fall in some mangled heap at the bottom. Does it do that? No. It settles back and it's destroyed. But we have asymmetrical damage from the airplane to the columns. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires, theoretically. We have asymmetrical damage from this mass. It's not even, how can it drive the rest of the building down straight when it's falling off the side of it. So it makes no sense. But look what's happening below. Complete symmetry all the way down to the ground.
Fire.
What are we looking at?
Bombs.
Is it a gravitational collapse? Or is it something else? Well, let's look at the lateral ejection. I mean, these are freely flying objects clocked by physicists 60 miles an hour laterally out of the towers, landing 300 to 500 feet away. And here's my favorite right there. We're talking 45 degrees. That's a horizontal component that's then taking gravity. Gravity works down. Something else is working out. What is it? It's destroyed the the Winter Garden 600 feet away in a massive destruction. We're not talking about these things peeling off the side. We're talking about freely flying objects with an energy capable of sending a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles, and a lot of these cannonballs. Where does this energy come from? It's not gravity. How about those pancakes, those floors? We're looking for a pancaking collapse in a building that has 110 floors. And we're looking for them stacked up, maybe 50, maybe 20. We don't see one of them in most of the photographs and videos. We see a 2-story, 3-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, etc. And we see no concrete. Those floors were 4-inch thick concrete on most of the floors. The mechanical floors, about 12 of them, had 8 or more inches thick of heavyweight concrete. It's being pulverized in mid-air, not when its gravitational potential develops and hits the bottom and then it cracks into a million pieces. It's mid-air, and that's how it gets spread across lower Manhattan. We're talking about 100 micron particles, most of it. And so what can pulverize all of that concrete? Up to 30% of that World Trade Center dust is concrete.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
In that dust was found some very interesting things by the U.S. Geological Survey. Those things prove that there were extremely hot temperatures. Hot temperatures is something that the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, Guide 921 for arson and fire and explosion investigation, says you should look for. You have to look for this stuff because many arson crimes are started with incendiaries, worked by extreme heat, produce a lot of fires. In fact, NIST helped write the NFPA 921. They should have been quite able and willing to use it, but they did not. Bechtel found 2,800 degree Fahrenheit, maybe 1,400 Celsius temperatures. These are way hotter than the fires. In fact, President of Tully Construction, the cleanup contractor, says there's pools of literally molten steel. And molten steel or iron is pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. NIST says, oh, that's melted airplane. Well, melted airplane looks like melted aluminum. It doesn't glow bright yellow and orange in daylight conditions. Nor does it melt steel beams, which are obviously melted, documented by Abul Hazem Astani in the Berkeley area, doing work for the National Science Foundation. This is clearly extremely hot temperature corrosion. Kerosene, which is jet fuel, cannot even get a half or a quarter of these temperatures by the manufacturer of one producer of the jet fuel says 699 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest that is, jet fuel can burn in open flames. But the author of the FEMA report, the original one, 2002, says steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partially evaporated. It takes 2,000 degrees Celsius to evaporate steel. And that's what's documented very carefully in that first NIST report in Appendix C in May of 2002. What do they say? Melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this. And this being melted concrete, like lava, flowing down, surrounding somehow the weapons in World Trade Center 6 Department of Treasury. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It takes 1,500 degrees Celsius or so to melt concrete. It's in the New York Police Museum today. I have no idea. They don't even talk about what it might mean. So here's a gentleman being asked a question. He's the lead co-project leader for NIST, Jonathan Gross, and here's his response.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who says so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
Volcano. Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And here's this gentleman, who we were just listening to, actually found the partially evaporated steel, saved it, gave it to FEMA. When he, with the NIST report, took over the investigation, they threw that Appendix C out of their report. So we don't have the extreme hot temperatures documented anymore. Yet his shadow is all over the evidence. So we're after him as well. The supporters of the official story say 650 degrees Celsius for normal office fires, 1,500 degree or so structural steel or iron melts. What can produce those temperatures? Okay, so let's get to it. Thermite is a possibility. 2,500 degree temperatures it creates. Let's see, though, if there's any evidence of that in the World Trade Center debris. And let's find out what thermite is anyway.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here. We've got a substance that could be responsible, creates the heat, creates the molten iron, and accounts for the sulfur, which officials find invading the steel as well. Wow, Well, let's pursue this. Again, NFPA 921 was not used by NIST. Others did, though. In fact, the US Geological Survey, doing toxicological studies on the dust, and R.J. Lee, a consulting firm, doing the same, find billions and billions and billions of previously molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair. They're ubiquitous throughout the dust. They're up to 6% of some of these samples contain these microspheres. This is incredible. They have no explanation of how they might have gotten there. And yet, it's a signature component of the dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these completely unexplained, previously molten iron microspheres in it. Where would they have come from? Well, if you had thousands of gutter charges laced throughout the columns and beams in these buildings, and then under explosive conditions, thermite cutter charges, for which there were patented devices before 9/11, very effective ones, the result would be molten iron that would be dispersed or aerosolized in the air. And so that might look something like this. You would see tens of thousands of these, you're getting wet, spheres. You can see them right here. They're spheres because the surface tension forms a tiny droplet of water into a sphere. That's just what it does. And so they might cool and fall with all the dust, which could account for the toasting of the tops of these cars. There's no other rational explanation for this phenomenon. Here's an experiment. Thermite. Slowing it down, you see thousands and thousands of what? Molten iron what? Spheres. The same spheres, by the way, found in the World Trade Center dust. The controlled experiment, World Trade Center dust. Iron, aluminum, oxygen, silica, manganese. What is in the World Trade Center dust that's very well documented by USGS R.J. Lee is the result of thermite. This is not difficult. There are patented devices that issue molten iron in milliseconds, cutting through structural steel much more effectively than high-energy explosives. But they're more expensive, so they're not used. Plus, these are normally, but these are deceptive controlled demolitions. So they wouldn't want the loud bang of high-energy explosives or the bright flash of them giving the signature such a strong visual and audio signature. Well, there's another team of scientists that looks in the dust in a deeper way even, and they're looking for unignited thermite. If there was the result of ignited thermite, would there not be unignited thermite? So people heard of their work and sent them these independently collected samples. And they analyzed them, like one from Jeanette McKinley's apartment right across the street from the South Tower, where her windows blew in, and all of this dust blew in and filled her apartment full of this stuff. She's an artist, so she saved it, sent one of the samples. There's 3 more that were very carefully documented. And they find in all the samples the same curious red-gray chips. They're red on one side, gray on the other, dual layer. So they appear to have been applied in a fluid, which probably is how they got their dual layer. They're about 1 millimeter or 2 long, the largest of them. And the red side is analyzed, and what do they find? Aluminum and iron oxide, the ingredients of thermite. That's why they come up to the magnet. They have a lot of iron in them. They also find oxygen and silica. This is thermite. Why is there thermite in all the World Trade Center dust? That's just not good. Well, they look into the red side with a 50,000 powered microscope. What do they find? Rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide particles that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. and aluminum platelets not much bigger. These are nanoscale particles of thermite. This is called nanothermite. We know about it. It's been discovered by the Lawrence Livermore Lab, Los Alamos Lab, developed as a very high-grade military material. It's set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, organic material. So we have a thermite that with small, extremely small particles creates a vast surface area, so you have instantaneous chemical ignition across these components. Much more explosive then, especially set in an organic bed, which provides the explosive force, expansion of organic material. As if we didn't know where these spheres came from. They're found attached to partially ignited nanothermite chips as well. There's no question, okay? We're talking about a very sophisticated material developed well before 9/11. In fact, NIST brought in experts from defense contractors like SAIC, Foreman Williams, to help lead this investigation of the World Trade Center. He himself being one of the developers of nanothermite and SAIC. So we're bringing in the fox to guard the henhouse. No wonder he didn't look for explosives. Extremely sophisticated material, built from the atomic scale up. This is all very carefully documented in a 24-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. And it stands uncontested. It's not like, well, if you have a reason to challenge a paper like this, a conspiracy theory, you put forth your own peer-reviewed paper and you challenge the results. That's what the scientific community does all the time. This has not been challenged in the peer-reviewed sense at all. People just say, oh, that's paint. What you just saw was the very exotic properties are not paint. So we believe that the hypothesis of controlled demolition is corroborated by the evidence. And we're reporting that in an open, transparent manner. And direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these 10, we believe. With additional corroborating evidence, is this, to you, proof of controlled demolition? So you recall I asked you 3 questions earlier. I'd like to ask the same 3 and have you be very honest with me and have everybody vote. How many believe that the Twin Towers came down, according to the official story, by jet plane impacts and jet fuel fires and a gravitational collapse down to the bottom? How many believe the official story? I see 1. Thank you. Anybody else? 2. Okay, and how many unsure? You might still be unsure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Any more over here? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Thank you. How many of you think the towers came down by controlled demolition? All of the rest of you. So you are the ones that are joining me with the big problem here. We've seen that explosives and incendiaries were likely used to destroy these skyscrapers, at least most of us here. But of course it takes months of advanced planning and engineering to execute such an operation. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the classic questions that enterprising journalists, criminal investigators should be asking, but are not. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to these extremely sophisticated explosives or incendiaries? The evidence that you've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that's been made available by the 9/11 Truth Movement. The architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth don't speculate about who might have been responsible. We don't have conspiracy theories. We're presenting evidence. It's up to you, therefore, to answer the questions that are numerous and ominous that have to be dealt with. So this is just the beginning of, admittedly, a disturbing but very, very essential opportunity for you to discover or uncover the rest of the mystery. We've got to follow up. How do we do that? There's things you can do. We've talked about that. Go to rethink911.ca, review there the Building 7 evidence. And look at the vast body of literature and DVDs and so forth that are available at our store at AE 9/11 Truth. More importantly, since we started our tour in Prince George, we've collected 16 people who are willing to consider running for Parliament based on the 9/11 Truth platform. So we're actually inviting you to take the opportunity to have a pulpit where the media will come to you and say, what are your issues? What do you stand for? You know that 9/11 is probably the most important issue we have in the world today, given that it changed everything that we talked about earlier. It's global war on terror, drone strikes, NSA surveillance, many things we didn't talk about, invasion of countries, more than Afghanistan and Iraq. This is just going to accelerate. It's time to stop it. Who's willing to consider running for Parliament on this platform? Yes, thank you, sir. And sir, thank you. And in the back, thank you. Thank you. And over here, thank you. What is your name? Hold your hands up high. I just want to hear your name. Troy McGill. And in the back, Roy Compton. Jordan Compton. Awesome. Thank you. What's your name?
My name is John Kalima.
John Kalima.
I ran on this issue.
You ran on this issue. I want to hear more about that when we get to Q&A. Thank you. We're going to give you an opportunity, a big one, to talk. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Peter E. Davenport.
Peter E. Davenport. Thank you. Over here?
Yeah, Sean David Harris.
Sean David Harris. Now, somebody, Karen, here we go. Would you find those people? Hold up your hand. We're not going to embarrass you, but we're going to hand you some information so we can get some contact information so we can tell you when the conference calls occur. So you can show up, we can coordinate. So keep your hands high, you guys who would like to consider running for office. That is just incredible in 2015. It takes a little bit of money, not to us, of course, but to your government, $1,000. And sometime in the future, you have plenty of time to deal with that. All you need is 100 signatures, and you're running. And if we get 50 candidates, we can start our own party. We just learned that the other day. So we'll support you as much as we possibly can. Hold your hand up high so Mike can find you. And we have DVDs. Again, you can get the DVDs and follow up. And there are many, many more issues than the World Trade Center. David Ray Griffin has written about many of them. Hijackers, planes, Shanksville, Pentagon, a whole host of issues, air defense drills, that many have done a lot of great research on that you can capitalize on to understand the greater picture that we don't have time to go into tonight in any detail. We also do have a petition on our site, ae911truth.org. Join the architects and engineers. There are 19,000 others. Sign the petition, upper left. And you can also become an AE 911 Truth local contact in your community. Simply go to the website and right here, take action. And you can fill out the form to have your name, your email address on our website so people from Toronto area looking at our website can find you, call you, ask you questions. Or if you want to be a little more active, you can join an AE 911 Truth action group or start one of your own. You meet monthly and you do stuff. That's the criteria. There's no cost for any of this. So we want people to be joining or starting action groups, 100 of them in Canada alone and hundreds around the world. So you can do that online quite easily. Whatever you do, though, follow your conscience and act. After all, if we allow the truth about 9/11 to be swept under the rug of history, we'll have more false flag attacks against Americans and Canadians and around the world, more wars all around the world, millions more killed, more economic manipulation with worsening financial crises, more loss of civil liberties, we become a whole lot less safe, of course. Whereas the truth about 9/11 illuminates these lies and results in the rectification of each of these disasters. So we see 9/11 in a whole new light, as a means of exposing massive corruption to its heights. More importantly, though, as a way of recovering from its ills. So it's not too late to decide for yourself, where do you draw your line in the sand? Do you wait for the next 9/11, predicted by members of our Congress and media to be far worse than the last? No. A time comes when silence is betrayal. Speak the truth. Thank you.
Well, I'm an engineer, and I'm a member of Engineers and Architects.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm just surprised that I didn't get an email from you guys to come to this meeting. I got it through my other routes.
Oh, well, we did send out 40,000 emails. There's 22,000 Canadians on our email list. So what you're going to want to do is make sure we have your latest email address.
I haven't changed it.
So
Anyway.
wait, go to the website, go to the website, click the news, sign up for newsletter, put your email address in there, and you'll get them from now on.
No problem. The point I wanted to make was I did run in 2006 federal elections, but I ran in Pickering area because one of my strong issues is, of course, anti-nuclear. And so it was not, I just didn't run on this issue as itself, but it was part of it. As a matter of fact, soon enough, my one book is coming out, in which also I support ReThink 9/11. And for your information, the title of the book is Climate Change in the Nuclear Age. So that's where it is focused on, but I do touch on 9/11 issues, and I just thought you might like to know that.
Thank you very much. And thanks for being willing to consider running. Fantastic. You want to bring these up to me or hand them to Mike? Where's Mike? See Mike sitting down there? You can hand it to him. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Can I turn this around?
Yes.
For all my students that are here, Studies in Propaganda will be starting on May the 5th this year. I see a lot of my students.
How many students are here?
There were several at the beginning who asked me all this, but I can see them out there. Don't know if they're going to put up their hands. My course is a very subversive course. And the university asked me 14 years ago, I'm a private investigative journalist, and asked me if I teach this to the community, so it's free. But the point is, on May the 5th, yeah, we will be starting out with 9/11. It will be about what happened in buildings 5 and 6, where the information they say they lost really went, and how the vault was emptied the night before the morning of 9/11, and the person who found and took the photographs for FEMA is now in Argentina. They're trying to extradite him, and the other person is in Sweden. So a lot went on while the second tower was coming down. A bomb erupted in 5 and came up this way, and it was these gentlemen that were with FEMA that saw the empty vault and knew that all the information they're telling you is gone is not gone. So that will be the first lecture in the course, and it will be at 6 o'clock Monday, May 5th, and it will be on campus here, probably in University College building. Now, if anyone wants to phone me about that, I'll give my number now. It's 416-787-0592. And I know, I can see a lot of you out there, but somehow you don't want to put your hands up. That's okay.
Thank you very much.
And as for being threatened, yes, I have.
Oh.
I have had a group come to my class and approach me on the podium to physically attack me. And luckily, a newspaper man was there at the time, and the person, not Mark, but someone who was filling in for him, photographed every face of the four.
Thank you.
So that's what they came to do, to shut down anything about 9/11. And then the Now censored my events so that people would never see when I'm doing a lecture at this school. So yeah, look out. You're not going to be disappointed one of these days.
Next question.
Hello. While watching this, a fundraising idea came to mind that might solve a few other problems as well. I'm not sure if anybody noticed or this happened to them, but shortly after 9/11, my car insurance went up. And I've heard from other people that their various types of insurance went up as well. And that's, largely because the reinsurers lost a huge whack of money as a result of the collapse. After paying all the insurance claims, the insurers are insured by other insurers. Those are called reinsurers. And so they lost so much money that you would think that they would be motivated to collect sufficient evidence to launch a court case to sue whoever might be responsible, government, whoever it turns out to be, to get some of that money back.
Most people who look at the subject of insurance fraud, by Larry Silverstein in particular, who did earn $5.68 billion from insurance companies, which counterbalanced his $125 million original investment out of pocket, find that the insurance companies profited enormously from 9/11 after and above and beyond their payouts. So I haven't done this research myself, but it's been suggested that they did very well and that they have no reason to start suing anybody.
Oh, well, it's worth a try.
And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Larry Silverstein's interviewed on PBS, and they're asking him about Building 7. And he says, well, there's been talking to the fire commander, and there's been such a terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And so they gave the order to pull, and we watched the building come down. So he says that, and everybody goes, what? So his office issues a correction. I didn't mean pull the building down. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, the firefighters were never allowed to fight the fires in the building at all. So he couldn't have meant that. So this is very interesting information, and I'm glad you brought it to our attention. It's not evidence, so I don't use it as evidence. I try to stick substantially to scientific forensic evidence. But I'm glad you brought it up.
Do you think anyone will question the authenticity of this interview?
Of what interview?
The one that Silverstein gave.
No one has, to my knowledge. Silverstein didn't question it.
Why it is not considered important enough to your presentation?
Because it's not evidence.
If nobody would question it...
It's not sworn testimony. It's people argue about it, and I don't want to get into arguments. I'd rather spend my precious time giving people facts and figures which are not arguable.
The interview lasted, what I saw of it, about maybe 10 to 15 seconds, with Silverstein live saying what he said about demolishing Building 7.
Well, he said pull it. And in fact, they were pulling buildings down at World Trade Center with cables. And so we get into arguments that that's what they were talking about.
Semantics.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we should reconsider it. My second question is, have you not seen the picture, the popular picture of the steel columns cut, slanted?
Yes. Here's another point which is evidence in some cases, but there were plenty of diagonal 45-degree cuts on the steel that were made by the iron workers cutting those tall 3, 4, 5-story columns that are on the perimeter with diagonal so that they can fold them down. And so the debunkers used that to try to debunk all of the 45-degree cuts. And so we set it aside because we don't want to be arguing with them.
Right. The key question here is, when was the photograph taken? To my knowledge, it was taken at a time when no crew would have had time to do this cutting.
You're referring to one very famous photograph of a thick core column with a diagonal cut that has slag pouring off the ends of it, which is obvious to most people in the 9/11 Truth Movement as being evidence of a controlled cutter charge. It's very interesting. It's the only one that I've seen that I think can be attributed to that source. All of the rest of them are suspect, so I threw them all out of my presentation.
Yeah, I think that it deserves some time to prove the time of when the picture was taken. If it was taken within an hour or two, then that will simply rule out any action of the crew on these columns.
Anybody have any solid evidence of when that photograph with the fireman in the hat in front of the core column is taken? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, so I agree. It's very interesting.
Democracy Now! You went to NBC, all the networks in Manhattan, and you tried to show them this explosive evidence. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
About the experience on the 11th?
Going to the, specifically going to media and attempting to get them to consider your presentation or your evidence.
Yes, September 11th was quite a day for us. We had a 50-foot tall billboard in Times Square overlooking Times Square. It was extraordinary, very expensive, and I think it was $40,000. Thank you. Congratulations. And we had a rally with Cynthia McKinney, Dr. William Pepper, many others, active and supporters of the 9/11 Truth Movement, right there on the street underneath. Well, earlier that day, we marched from, we went to Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman's news reporting, because she refuses to report on 9/11, and though she was there that day, Building 7, running away from it, actually. And just will not deal with that issue of the 9/11 with the buildings coming down. We went to CNN, we went to Fox, we went to MSNBC, we delivered the evidence, the petition, the DVDs, and we got very little, if any, response. We had a letter writing campaign to the New York Times. It was it was eye-opening. A lot of fun, a lot of effort. That's the kind of thing we like to do, is to put the evidence in the face of people with a little more assertion and less passivity, because time goes on, and it's 13 years now, and we're how long is it going to go before it busts open? Many people liken it to filling a swimming pool. In a year you come back and it's just in the time scale of 9/11, it's not full yet. But 3 or 4 years later, we're all noticing a difference out in the street as we give brochures. And people are taking them with more receptivity, more interest. They've heard it from a few friends, so now they're actually considering that it might be reality. How many of you are finding it easier in the last 4 years, those of you who've been at this 4 or 5 years? It's interesting, isn't it? So something's happening out there. We don't have standing room only in these rooms, but something's happening. It could be like the 100th monkey, where something's going to happen, it's going to bust open, and all of a sudden, like today with the Toronto ads on the screens in the train station platforms, I get 4 or 5 requests for interviews, so I can hardly manage my time the last couple of days as a result of all of this. So who knows what's going to happen? We have Sun TV. How many of you heard of Sun TV? I didn't know. You don't like them. Well, they're here. Coming down on
Who works for Fox News.
Fox
Right,
News.
so Fox News have exposed it.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
It's the mainstream media. It's a $3 trillion industry that we have
The day
to
9/11
go
happened,
against.
all the Jews were told to stay away from work. Is that true too?
I don't know. I haven't
Oh, you don't
researched
know?
that. There's a lot of things I don't know.
Is it possibly true that all the Jews were told not to go to work that day?
Oh, well, I suppose that's possible. I have no
Right.
idea. They're just looking for ways to attack the messenger. And I, by the way, I have no idea. I just don't research that area. That was my answer.
Who did you talk to? Who were the other media?
Oh, AM 640, we did a great interview. Jeff MacArthur was actually quite open, allowed us to go on about the evidence. It was very helpful. The bald guy? Michael Corrin.
Michael Corrin. And after posing all those questions to people that were waiting to come in, when your actual lecture started, he put his coat on and left. And I confronted him about it. He refused to stay and hear your side of the story, your proper presentation of the facts.
Yeah.
He put his coat on and he disappeared.
They're just not interested. Okay. Thank you. That's the way it goes.
You guys aren't going to stay for the event? You guys aren't going to stay for the event? No? No?
Settling all of these out of court, so the record, the evidence does not get into court, and for dismissing ones, the other ones. Some, in this case, Bush's cousin, John Walker, was a judge in an appellate court which slapped a $10,000 fine on William Veal, who was representing April Gallup, who crawled out of the hole said to have been caused by the plane, which is said to have hit the Pentagon. So we certainly have huge problems with corruption in the judicial system, and it is very difficult. And that is one reason. So, did you have some other ideas about that?
I've been pushing for a new investigation now since 2005 when I started researching this, and I just can't see the government investigating themselves on this issue.
Well, that's a good question right there. Our petition is to Congress demanding a real investigation. We don't imagine, we did in the beginning, I was pretty naive when I started this. I thought, everybody's just going to look at this rationally based evidence and agree with me, and we're going to have an investigation within a year. This whole thing's going to... And little did I realize that it's a very different reality because we're dealing with people's world views, which we're asking to change them. Because the implications of these evidence being pointing to some sort of an inside operation, very high, very wide. It's scary to imagine that level of control and manipulation, not just over the media, government officials, but over us, our family members, our friends. They become the most effective tool of those who are the perpetrators and who seek to keep this covered up. And so it's scary to imagine what percentage, 60, 70, 80% of people are completely unwilling and will to look at the evidence first, to listen to you, and then you would in turn have access to all the core columns you could plant without occupants seeing you. Now, if you had an elevator modernization, like the largest one in the world going on, say, 9 months prior to 9/11, which is what was going on, Ace Elevator had the contract, you could have an undercover operation that could possibly plant such explosives. In fact, there was lots of work going on in there. White powder was rampant throughout, getting into the ventilation systems, and the desks and so forth were covered daily during this renovation. So they would have had to have cut through the gypsum board enclosures around each of the elevator shafts to access. So that's a set of possibilities, which we certainly want an investigation of Ace Elevator in this case. Ace Elevator had 85 employees in the building at the time the planes hit the towers. They fled. These are experts in the delivery system for victims out of high-rises. And the firefighters depend on them and their expertise. And they fled. It was quite a scandal that was documented in USA Today. So we certainly want an investigation. We certainly wouldn't have to have, by the way, miles and miles of detonation cord or cabling. This is a very expensive operation, which theoretically would have a fairly unlimited budget, black ops like this. So they would use, radio frequency controlled detonation devices, whatever those detonation devices are.
I'm aware you have a lot of 9/11 families working with you guys, and I just wanted to know if you had any family members who were on the flights from like Shanksville or the one that hit the Pentagon, or even the two towers, the planes that hit the two towers. Do you have any family members?
Sure. Ellen Mariani lost her husband in one of the planes that hit, I think it was the one that hit the South Tower. She had a lawsuit that went almost to the Supreme Court, suing, I don't remember the specifics. Anybody remember the specifics of Ellen Mariani's suit, by the way? And she lost eventually because they wouldn't look at the evidence for some technicality. It's very, very unfortunate. Most of the family members received large amounts of money in settlement and agreed to not talk about things. So that is an effective silencer of the families.
My name is Barry Shanebaum. I'm a radio broadcaster. I have a show in Kitchener each Sunday called Perspectives. Richard Gage was on my show last year. Richard B. Lee, Mike Bondi, Adnan Zuberi, Barry Swicker, Sibel Edmonds, David Ray Griffin, many times have been on my show. I want to thank Richard for doing this today. And if you can support AE 9/11 Truth, it's important. In addition, there's an initiative on right now called NYC High Rise Initiative. Any of you aware of it? Okay. Ted Walter is on my show this coming Sunday after Noam Chomsky, where we don't even talk about that stuff because he's a non-believer, as you know. There's a ballot initiative going on very soon in New York City. If you go to the website and just type in NYC High Rise Safety Initiative, they're raising money to hire petitioners to put on the ballot November the 4th just to vote on a new investigation of World Trade Center number 7. So it's very important they raise the money if you can support it, and also support Richard Gage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. The High Rise Safety Initiative is an effort by the New York Coalition for Accountability Now, which put 80,000 signatures on a ballot initiative that was supposed to go to the people of New York, and which asked or demanded for a new investigation. Now they have a new idea, and we're supporting it 100%. This will require an investigation of any high-rise building that falls down.
In New York City.
In New York City. Yeah. So Building 7 fell down. So Building 7 would be the first investigation that would be required under this initiative. So it's really quite clever. It has the support of many family members and 9/11 Truth groups. I encourage you to support it.
I'm amazed at the way that you've grown and spread your message, and so I feel honored to be able to work with you, and I feel like you're a giant and you'll go down in history as a good man. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. My question is, so you've asked us to start a conversation with our friends, family. I'm also wondering if you can coach us in some questions or ways that we can approach that conversation without maybe losing those friends that we would like to keep.
Yeah, good point. Well, we have some great evidence cards outside. The brochure is basically the evidence card that you have. You can buy them for like $10 for, I don't know, 100 or more of them. And they have the Building 7 on the left, as you've seen, World Trade Center Twin Towers on the right. And you can say, hey, have you heard about the third high-rise on 9/11? Most likely they'll go, no, what are you talking about? Even if they're defensive about the Twin Towers, you kind of slip under the radar with the third tower that we're talking about. And so you can say, wow, yeah, and you know how fast that sucker came down? Just like this. And you know, they found evidence of incendiaries in the pile underneath. This is amazing. It blew me away. You know, there's 2,100 architects and engineers who are staking their reputations on demanding a new investigation.
I just want to add something about
Can
the
you use
illness.
the microphone?
Oh.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Just.
Yeah, hi. The gentleman before, he just mentioned about alternative news paper. Well, I produce the Toronto Street News. I've been had three arson attacks and 2 attempts to run me off the expressway at high speed.
Oh.
With a driverless vehicle. Get that?
How come you're getting all the attention?
Yeah. So well, I cover the issues you just said about chemtrails, especially, you know, and the vaccines and all the rest of it. We all know these. Everybody here, I think, knows these issues. And let's get it out of this room and sell it to other people. That's for sure.
Yeah, right on.
I started, I guess, about 5 years ago. We had a press conference back in 2009, I think it was, Richard?
Yes.
And so that was probably where I started. I've done a lot of work with Richard over the years as part of the writing team. I've been on Barry's radio show a couple of times. Some of those shows have been with Kevin Ryan, who's done wonderful research on 9/11, Bob McIlvain, Laurie Manuel, who's done incredible research on the psychology of 9/11. There's been all kinds of the Toronto hearings. I helped to do the webcast and organize the Toronto hearings, which was a historic event a few years back. These tours, of course, it's the second one with Richard going across Canada. I was involved with one with Dr. Niels Harrit, one of the chief scientists with the nanothermite paper. So it's all kinds of things. Street actions where we go out, hand out DVDs, talk to people, answer questions. These are all fantastic things that you can do. And there's many more. There's all kinds of volunteer opportunities with 8911 Truth.
And here in Toronto, how can they get involved? What do they do? Where do they go?
I don't really know how to answer that, Richard. I actually am not in Toronto. I'm in Stratford. I don't know the...
Is there anybody in Toronto that's active who would like to invite others to join you in doing something? You can see why our movement is needing help. That's fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to add? So you're on your own. Google Toronto 9/11 Truth. Google We Are Change Toronto. Yes, sir.
I should mention.
Can't hear you.
I should mention that most Saturday afternoons downtown at the corner, perhaps the most important intersection of Yonge and Dundas Street on the southwest corner, you have
Yonge and Dundas, Saturday afternoons.
Yes,
what happens?
You have truthers who hand out information about things like 9/11 Truth.
Great.
It's pretty regular.
Meet us down there. Now, did you have anything else you want to add?
Karen wanted me to mention that we're going to the Madison Pub. Where is that, Karen?
The Madison Pub. You can join us for beer. We'll have some deep discussions.
John McMurtry, the moral decoding of 9/11. And for about a $4 donation to cover the cost of printing. I could really recommend it highly. Everyone who's seen this says it's an extremely rich look at how the money sequences around the world are very much involved. He's the author of The Cancer Stage of Capitalism. So he links up the economy with the events of 9/11. And you can get it over on the table to the left as you exit.
Lawyers for 9/11 Truth, political leaders for 9/11 Truth, religious leaders for 9/11 Truth, police for 9/11 Truth, journalists and media professionals for 9/11 Truth, pilots for 9/11 Truth, physics for 9/11 Truth, scholars for 9/11 Truth, and intelligence officers for 9/11 Truth. So we're not alone.
Thank you.
We'll get some more at the bar. Yeah. Doing a shot with Richard. That's what let's get a shot with Richard.
Yeah. I think I would recommend this to anybody to really, be a good eye wake, open up or,
Your mind will even go a step further and think on its own. Absolutely. It's a combination of everything. So
Felt like we got the evidence out there. Felt like it was very well accepted. I think we turned most of the unsureds to agreeing, and we didn't have anybody actually saying that they believed. No, we did have 2 left over saying they believed the official story. Not sure who they were or what their reluctance was. but we certainly delivered the evidence as well as we have in any other stop along the way here.
But there were a couple who showed up who originally believed the original story, and now they come out here with the changed mind?
Yes, there were several who have changed their minds, and several unsureds who became sure of what happened with respect to the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7 by controlled demolition.
Mm-hmm. And for the rest of this tour, what have you got in store, and what can people expect from the following couple days?
Well, the good news is that we have a formula that works. We present the evidence, Building 7 first. People open their minds to it because they don't have all of the baggage associated with the Twin Towers. We were put in a state of shock in that morning, and we're not, many of us, not even capable of rationally responding to evidence regarding the Twin Towers. Because of that, we think we know what happened to those towers. We're in pain, actually, as a result of the stress induced on that day.
For the people who are new to this and just learning about this information now, what sort of advice might you have moving forward, and how these people can get involved in this movement?
Well, we want people, first of all, to be informed with the evidence, to use it to educate others, and we have brochures, DVDs, even a book and newspaper to do that with. So once people become informed, we want them to act. And people here seemed very excited to act. In fact, we had over 6 people sign up to raise their hand, indicating their willingness to run for office in Parliament on the 9/11 Truth platform. That's extraordinary. That's the most we've had from any of our stops. So we have well over 25 at this point.
Mm-hmm. I believe there's an NDP MP out in Ottawa who's going to be presenting a petition, or I think you guys are trying to get him to present a petition, right?
Indeed, this is Paul Dewar, who's receiving a lot of constituent pressure to walk the petition of 1,400 of his constituents down to the office and submit it. That's all he has to do, and we will be off of his back.
Any final thoughts on the rest of the tour and how the whole ReThink 9/11 campaign's been going?
Yes, very exciting. We continue one foot in front of the other, one day after another. We head to London next, and then Moncton, Fredericton, and Halifax. We're going to Ottawa, Montreal, and we end up in Newfoundland. I've never even heard of Newfoundland, so I understand it's a great place to be. We're going to actually take a couple of days off after this grueling 17-city tour.
So going coast to coast, where can people go to learn about how they can get tickets and come see your presentations?
Yes, rethink911.ca. That's rethink911.ca.
May the force be with you, my friends.